Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. In attacks across Afghanistan in the past week, more than 31 people have been killed and scores injured, mostly personnel of the Afghan security forces and the police. Going by the trend since the withdrawal of the US-led mission, Afghan national security forces have been losing ground to the Taliban. Just last week, villages in the northern Afghan province of Faryab were appealing to the Kabul government for help after being cut off from food supplies for weeks by a Taliban blockade. In the middle of this growing chaos, Donald Trump, the US president, has indicated that he is interested in resolving this wicked problem and get out. To that end, Zalmay Khalilzad, the special envoy for Afghan reconciliation, has met with the Taliban and also with regional countries, including Pakistan, to get the Taliban to begin talking seriously and for Pakistan to facilitate that process, including getting the Taliban to stop opposing the inclusion of the current Kabul government in any talks leading to a solution. During Khalilzad's visit to Pakistan last week, Pakistan Army's Public Relations Directorate indicated that the army was behind the latest efforts for a political settlement with the Afghan Taliban to end the 17-year-old war, urging Washington to leave Kabul as a friend of the region rather than a failure. Meanwhile, a key Afghanistan Taliban commander was killed in a US airstrike earlier this month. Mullah Abdul Manan Akhund was the Taliban's governor and military chief for the southern Helmand province. Some analysts, especially in Kabul, say the US and Russia have bypassed the Afghan government and engaged the Taliban directly, and this could be disastrous. To discuss what lies ahead and in continuation of our discussion last week, we have with us Dr. Moeed Yusuf, Associate Vice President, United States Institute of Peace, Rahimullah Yousafzai, Resident Editor, The News in Peshawar, Dawood Azmi, who works at the BBC and joins us from London, and Syed Mustafa Khoshcheshm, a journalist based in Tehran. Let me begin with Dr. Yusuf. US is asking for Pakistan to facilitate the talks, but does Pakistan know what the US endgame is? The Taliban so far has resisted talking to Kabul. The DG ISPR also said that Pakistan is influenced with the Taliban, but it's not open-ended. How do you look at it?
Well, I think nobody knows the end game. That's the reality. And, I am at least of the opinion that we shouldn't be trying, or nobody should be trying to decipher this end game to a point where you get to paralysis in decision making. Look, there is so much mistrust between the US and Pakistan, Ejaz, that I simply don't see any way that the US can convince Pakistan of its end game, no matter what end game it suggests. If the US says today, we're leaving tomorrow, nobody's going to believe that. I think the US itself doesn't know whether it wants to leave Afghanistan or not. That will depend on the conditions on the ground. So I think you've got to play with what you have. Similarly, the US, I think, ultimately should not be asking Pakistan beyond a point what Pakistan ultimately wants in Afghanistan, how it will get there, it wants the Taliban in charge or not, how much power does it want the Taliban to have. Pakistan doesn't know. I think it depends on how things shape up that everybody will decide. The US may leave, it may not leave, but the ground situation will determine that. So we've got to play with the cards we have. Everybody does. If we keep trying to get guarantees in a relationship where there's so much mistrust, I simply don't see how this is going to work.
Okay, let me, assuming that Khalilzad came to Pakistan, he's also been talking to the Taliban, and essentially the ask is that there has been a government in Kabul, there is a constitution, there's a certain political configuration, and that the Taliban should, after talking to the United States, at some point also talk to the Kabul government. And when that thing happens, then we go back essentially to what President Ashraf Ghani said about reconciliation, including the withdrawal timetable and also a review of the Constitution. So do you think one can say that that is the broad end game before the US decides to withdraw, or is there something more to it?
Just look, I can give you an answer. I can give you a detailed answer. I think this is just simply the wrong time to be discussing this.
Okay.
The first conversation to have is who has influence over the Taliban, enough influence to bring them to the table. Does anybody have that influence? Are the Taliban interested in talking? Because they seem to be doing fairly well on the battlefield. We've got to cross that hurdle before. Look, if we start asking these questions too early in the conversation, what you're going to end up with is people saying, well, they're not serious. One side is not serious. The other doesn't want it. Somebody doesn't want it. I can answer this, but these answers will change over time given how things move. And so, yes, the US wants a reconciliation process. There needs to be political settlement. They want the Taliban to join the election process. What if the Taliban today say, well, we will join the elections, and then tomorrow say we won't? What happens? Does it fall apart? I think we should take this one step at a time. The first thing is, how do you bring the Taliban to the table to talk to the US government and then ultimately to the Afghan government? That's what we need to focus on and nothing more, otherwise it's going to get complicated.
Okay, Mohit, stay with me. I'm going to hop across to Rahimullah Yousafzai. Rahimullah Yousafzai, you heard Dr. Mohit Yusuf say that we have to take one step at a time and that no one really knows, and perhaps including the United States, what the end game is. Would you agree with that?
I think I will partly agree with Dr. Mohit Yusuf. You know, we all are actually a bit unaware about the end game. You know, there are different stakeholders, and I think they have different things in mind. But let me add that the U.S. is talking to Taliban. Taliban are talking to the U.S. You know, it's not that all the sides, you know, want to continue the fight. I think that all the sides, I believe, want to negotiate as well. The fighting is to gain the upper hand.
Correct.
The fighting is to, you know, to be in a better position, a stronger position to negotiate. That, I think, is why there is more intense fighting now, more attacks by Taliban. So I think that, you know, we all know what the Taliban want. Taliban want victory. They want to return to power.
When you say that Taliban want victory, what exactly or how would you define victory? Because we have seen so far, at least, that the Taliban, while they have not allowed Kabul and the supporting US troops to win on the battlefield, neither have the Taliban really won on the battlefield, quite apart from the fact that they've been gaining territory. But as far as the cities are concerned, they're well defended. And if we go back to what happened after the Soviet withdrawal, Dr. Najibullah, as you know, Rahimullah Yousafzai, he managed to thwart any attempt by the jihadi groups to take over the territory, at least the cities. So don't you think that the Taliban know that it will be difficult for them to actually gain access to those nodal points?
I think Taliban also understand. They actually will privately tell you that they're not expecting a complete victory. They cannot hope to capture big cities and then retain control of the big cities. I think what they are hoping for, what they're waiting for is that once the foreign troops leave, then there will be a collapse of the Afghan government and the Afghan army. That is their hope. And this is why, you know, they have been saying we can afford to wait. It's our country. We can wait as long as possible. That is how this, you know, this story.
Okay, so if this is the Taliban thinking,
and we have the time.
If this is the Taliban thinking,
how they see it. They also realize that, you know, let's try this peaceful route. Let's talk. What can we get? Can we also, you know, satisfy our rank and file? Because if they can get something out of these talks, for example, if they can get some of their people released, if they can get some of their leaders off the blacklist of the UN Security Council, you know, I think if they can get a few things, then they will become seriously involved in negotiations.
Okay, so what we are saying is that at this point in time, the Taliban believe that they need to talk about the withdrawal of the US troops, and then they will contend on the ground with the Afghan National Security Forces. But the US while saying that we want to resolve this, have also said fairly clearly that there's not going to be any withdrawal until the terms of an agreement have been chalked out.
Yes, I think this withdrawal will not take place at once. There will be a timetable of withdrawal.
Yeah.
And that period will be used by the U.S. and its allies to further try and strengthen the Afghan security forces and the Afghan government. This is how the plan was. Post-December 2014, all the effort has gone into trying to strengthen the Afghan security forces. They have been also given, aircraft. They now have got a small air force as well. So this period will be used to try also to size up the Taliban, how much, power they have, what can they do, where will they attack, where can we defend. I think these things will also happen. The Americans won't leave the Afghan government at the mercy of Taliban.
Okay. I'm going to take a short break, and at the other break, we'll continue with this discussion. Welcome back to Indus Special. We continue with our discussion of the Afghan imbroglio and also President Trump's policy, which he says is essentially based in getting a consensus among the regional countries, i.e. a regional solution to Afghanistan. We are also joined now with Dawood Azmi, who is an Afghan analyst, works at the BBC and is based in London. Dawood Azmi, before you joined us, we were discussing the prospects of an end game. What exactly is the end game? And my analyst told me that no one really knows what the end game is. There is also a sense in Kabul and perhaps elsewhere also that the US and Russia in engaging the Taliban have probably jumped ahead of the curve and that this could be disastrous. Would you agree with that?
Well, the end game is to have a peaceful Afghanistan, which is in peace at home and in peace with the region and with the rest of the world. Okay. So this is how it should be. If there is peace within Afghanistan, if all the Afghan factions and political parties sit together and agree on how to run the country and agree on the constitution and the rest of it, so that will be peace at home. And when it comes to regional or international peace, it means that there will be no groups in Afghanistan which will pose a threat to the region or to international peace. What we witnessed in the 1990s was an Afghanistan which was at war at home and was posing a threat to the region and the rest of the international community. So this is what the US now wants, a guarantee that there will be peace in Afghanistan and there wouldn't be any groups that will pose a threat to the US or its allies. So this is what the negotiations between the Americans and the Taliban are about.
Okay. So, right. So this is, you say, the broad, concept of the end game, where Afghanistan is at peace at home and also at peace in the region and generally with the rest of the world. Now, given the US objective of talking to the Taliban, and the fact that during the Moscow round, the Taliban consistently called themselves the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan and have so far shown no desire to talk to the government in Kabul. So how exactly is that likely to happen, if at all?
Well, it will happen in 3 phases. The first phase, which is taking place at the moment, is a phase of talks between the Taliban and the Americans. And then in the next phase, they will go to talks between Taliban, the Afghan government, and other factions that are inside Afghanistan. So that will be the next phase. The third phase will be the implementation of the political deal. So when it comes to the second phase, it also involves the role of regional countries, because region has to play a very important and very big role to ensure that Afghanistan remains safe, Afghanistan doesn't pose a threat to the region or to the rest of the world. So what the region needs to do is to cooperate with the Afghans and the Americans to reach a political settlement, because without their support, it will be very difficult for the US and for the Afghans to reach a settlement, because many countries like Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and China can play a very important role, not only to convince different parties, but also to put pressure on some parties to enter a dialogue and agree to a ceasefire and eventually sign a political settlement. And they can also become guarantors of that settlement, which will be signed by all sides and factions at the end, to ensure that nobody is harmed at the end and everybody's interests are secured. Basically, what we saw in 2001 in Bonn, so the same arrangement can be made now. But the only difference would be that this time the Taliban will also be part of that process. Because in 2001, Taliban were ignored. They were not included in the Bonn process, but all the other Afghan factions and all the other regional players and international players were part of that process. So what is needed now is another conference or settlement, which will involve all the Afghan sides and factions, including the Taliban, and which will also need the support of all the regional players as well as American and NATO allies of the Afghan government.
Okay, Dawood Azmi, stay with me. I'm going to Rahimullah Yousafzai. Yousafzai, Dawood Azmi has said, here's the end game. Afghanistan at peace at home and at peace with the outside world, one. Secondly, he's talked about the three phases. And the President Trump's statement or his desire to have a regional solution, which is what Zalmay Khalilzad has also been saying, involves various countries. And as you know, Zalmay he did not just come to Pakistan, but there were 8 countries on his list where he went. So tell me, do you agree with this idea of the 3 phases? And it seems to me that Dawood Azmi is a little more optimistic than either you were or before you, Dr. Moeed Yusuf was. Would you share his relative optimism, or would you stick to what you said earlier about the various snags during this process?
Ejaz, we have seen so much of all this in the past. So many agreements signed and then violated, so much violence. It has been continuing for so long. It has become so complex. There is a lot of foreign interference. That's why it does not really make you optimistic. Mm-hmm. But compared with the past efforts, this, I think, is a more serious effort. That's why there is room for optimism. That, okay, now the U.S. is finally, insisting and focusing on finding a political solution. The Taliban are also finally talking. The other countries are offering and promising support. So that's why I think Dawood Azmi and, others and also myself, we think that this is, a more focused and serious effort. But now, as he said, and as you have also said now, that how to achieve that goal, the end game or whatever. My view is that there have been so many occasions for an end game in Afghanistan that I see every end game as the beginning of a new game. I think that somehow the end game never happens, never comes. Because as soon as you talk about an end game, there's a new game which begins and then it never ends.
It's like snakes and ladders, you go to 99 and then you back to, square one. But tell me, Dawood Azmi talked about, he referred to the earlier Bonn process, and he said that the Taliban were excluded from that. Now, with hindsight, and of course, hindsight is 2020, but with hindsight, would you agree that excluding the Taliban from the Bonn process at that time, which primarily had to do with the US hubris, was a bad policy?
You know, Lakhdar Brahimi, who was the UN Special Envoy for Afghanistan at that time, and who played a leading role, in the Bonn conference, he later said it was a mistake to keep the Taliban out.
Okay.
But look at those days, December 2001. Was there any chance that, Taliban would be invited to join the conference? Was there? Because, they had been defeated.
Yeah.
And, everybody was saying Taliban are history, Taliban are gone. Why revive them? Why give them a seat at the table? That was I think, the view at that time. So even if it was a mistake, I don't think there were the right conditions to involve them in this process or to give them a share in power. Taliban also would not have come around and joined this process because, they had primarily saved their resources. Their losses were not huge.
Yeah.
They had just retreated. They had accepted defeat, but they were waiting for another day to try to reassemble, regroup, and start fighting again. So I don't think that, it would have made any, breakthrough if Taliban were there and if they were involved. There could have been some people among Taliban. Some of them maybe could have been co-opted, but not the huge majority, the leadership. That, I think, was out of question.
That was out of question. Let me go to Dawood Azmi. Dawood Azmi, we talk about the regional solution, and as you mentioned, Pakistan, Iran, Russia, China, these countries have also tried their own sort of peace tracks. And there's also a sense in Afghanistan that some of these countries have been spoilers in terms of bringing peace to Afghanistan or the effort to bring peace to Afghanistan because they have their own geostrategic interests here. But let me ask you another question, which is a different one from what we normally talk about, i.e. that the regional countries are spoilers. Since you are an Afghan and you know the political configuration in Afghanistan very well and you analyze it, give us a sense of the spoiler effect within Afghanistan. Are there people, political leaders or others or warlords or people who have actually benefited from this insurgency economy who can play the role of spoilers in this current effort?
Well, in every war, there are war profiteers. There is a constituency in every conflict which benefits from war, from the continuation of the conflict. And it is the same in Afghanistan. There are people who benefit from the ongoing conflict. They will not be happy with peace. And then on the other hand, there are a lot of people who have concerns. Some of their concerns are very genuine. For example, there is a constituency which is worried about the human rights issues, and they don't know what will happen to women's rights. Women would be allowed to work, or women would be allowed to study or not if Taliban join the government or if there is a political settlement. So there's another constituency. The third constituency is the one which benefits both politically and financially from the war. But they are in minority. The vast majority of people of Afghanistan want peace. Afghanistan has been in conflict for decades, and most of the people in Afghanistan are sick and tired of this conflict. And by the way, it is the biggest war today in the world. The war in Afghanistan is bigger than the war in Syria. It is much bigger than the war in Yemen.
It certainly has been the longest
much bigger
war.
than the war in Iraq. So the vast majority of people want peace. They are thirsty for peace, and the people who benefit from war, either politically or financially, they're in minority.
Okay. Dawood Azmi, when we look at the history of Afghanistan, and correct me if I'm wrong, we see that every time Kabul has tried, any government, whether it was a monarchy or, the PDPA or later, other factions that ruled Kabul, every time Kabul has tried to centralize authority, the countryside has refused to fall in line. And the general trend has been that Kabul has to negotiate with the solidarity groups, with the Qawm or the Aqwam and tribes in Afghanistan. Now, with this political configuration, it's almost a similar kind of configuration, despite differences, which the PDPA had tried to put in place and which failed, and then the Soviet Union had to send in the troops. Do you think that now there is space for Kabul's central authority, or whether Kabul will have to still understand that it has to make various deals with the representatives of the solidarity groups in the far-flung areas and in the countryside?
Well, the government in Kabul, whether it was in peacetime or in the war years, is the representative of a faction of Afghans or all the Afghans. So what is happening now is, or what is needed now, is a consensus at home. That's why the Afghan government announced last week, earlier this week, an advisory council or a consultative council which has more than 30 members. So this council will be advising the negotiating team of the Afghan government, which eventually will be meeting the Taliban. So this council has representatives from all ethnic groups, from all political parties, and from all zones or regions of Afghanistan. So that's how the government is trying to ensure that every faction, every region, every ethnic group, every political group is represented in this consultative group. This group will, in a way, be controlling and advising the 12-member negotiating team, which will be eventually meeting the Taliban. And in the High Peace Council, which was formed a few years ago, was a similar case.
Yeah, but the High Peace Council was very ineffective.
Were represented, and all the factions and regions were represented. And the idea was that nobody is left alone, because if one faction is left alone, then that might become the start of another conflict. So that's why the Afghan government needs to be very careful when it is talking to the Taliban in the future, that its teams are inclusive and its teams are authoritative. So they have to ensure that. Otherwise, if one faction is left out or if one party is not happy, then the objective wouldn't be realized.
Okay, so a last question. When we look at the situation, and it's not the current situation, over many years now, and every time I've been to Kabul, and at least once I was there with Rahimullah Yusufzai, and we were talking to people, and there was a general sense that the people think that the Kabul elites are corrupt. There's a lot of unemployment. Of course, the fact that much of the revenue of Afghanistan is essentially funding from abroad. People have made, they've stashed their money abroad in Dubai and elsewhere. Now, given that kind of situation, I felt, it was my sense that the common people were neither particularly happy with the way they were governed, nor were they very optimistic about the fact that, the Kabul elite will stay in Afghanistan if things became bad. Would you agree with that? Do you think that my sense was correct?
Well, I mean, you are right that a lot of people are not happy, and they are right, because there is a lot of unemployment. The violence has been there, and as I said earlier, that this is the biggest war in the world, and some of the figures say that only this year, from January until early December, more than 40,000 Afghans have been killed.
Yeah.
In just 11 months. They include civilians, they also include the Afghan soldiers and policemen, and they also include the Afghan Taliban.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of people that were killed in just 11 months of this year, more than 40,000. So obviously a lot of people would be unhappy. The government institutions are not that strong to serve the people. They cannot provide basic services to all the population of the country. But in the meantime, a lot of people are happy, because if you compare Afghanistan today with what it was 20 years ago or 25 years ago, so it is much better for a lot of people. A lot of people have jobs, millions of people have jobs. They send their children to schools. Offices are running, and there is a lot of economic activity. There has been a lot of investment. There has been a lot of aid. But if you go to other side of the story, or if you want to see the other side of the coin, it's a different story.
It's a different story.
A lot of people are also suffering. So
absolutely,
that's why
especially people outside Kabul or the main urban centers. Thank you so much, Dawood Azmi, for giving us your time and your insights. I want to take a break, but Rahimullah Yusufzai stays with me. At the other end of the break, we'll be joined by Sayyid Mustafa Khoshcheshm, who, as I said, is a journalist based in Tehran. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We continue with our discussion of Afghanistan with specific reference to US President Donald Trump's regional policy towards Afghanistan, something that Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad has been at pains to sell to the regional countries. And obviously, the region also includes Iran. Now, Iran is a country which Donald Trump has managed to essentially once again throw to the wilderness. The JCPOA, which was a painstaking deal cut under President Obama's tenure, Donald Trump has pulled back from that and has slapped sanctions on Iran once again. So the question really is, Iran, which also has its interest in Afghanistan, how does Trump's regional policy work in relation to Iran with reference to Afghanistan? And for that, as I indicated before taking a break, that Sayyid Mustafa Khoshcheshm, who's a journalist and analyst based in Tehran, is with us, and we shall ask him how this is going to work.
Yes, you know, the United States has long felt this clash of interests with the Islamic Republic of Iran. So ever since they came to realize that they may not topple the Islamic Republic through military force, they've been seeking to restrain Iran's power and weaken Iran's power components one by one. That includes Iran's nuclear industries in progress, Iran's missile program, and Iran's regional clout. In this third, category, now they are trying to heat the environment around Iran to pose various types of tensions to the Iranian borders, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and elsewhere, with the help of their regional allies, including Saudi Arabia, especially Saudi Arabia and Israel. So there have been official reports and photos emerging and surfacing in the media showing that terrorists, separatist organizations from Kurds to Baluch to, some Arab separatists they have been coordinating their, cross-border attacks and terrorist operations with Saudi Arabia, and they have been receiving training, backup, and financial support from the United States.
I understand that. That's the broader picture in the greater Middle East. But specifically in relation to Afghanistan, since Trump is talking about a regional solution, and since Iran is a regional country with interests in Afghanistan, how does this regional policy work given what Trump has done with Iran?
Well, the point here is that within the same strategy, they are working in Afghanistan in order to raise the stakes for Tehran. There have been reports that have been endorsed by Russians and Iranians that ISIL, Daesh, has been moved to Afghanistan, at least part of this failed organization after the defeat in Syria and Iraq, in order to, escalate tensions in Afghanistan. Afghanistan neighbors.
So you are saying that the U.S. You are saying that the U.S. It's the U.S. policy to move ISIL from Syria and Iraq to Afghanistan?
Yes, that's basically true. And it's not just for Iran. ISIL is going to be moved, and it has already been moved. Large parts of ISIL commanders have been moved back from Syria to Afghanistan in order to control the situation and to lead the terrorist, operations in there, to pose threat to Russia, to China, that's the main economic rival of the United States, and also to Iran that neighbors Afghanistan.
Okay. So let me try and understand this. If this is correct, then that means that Trump's statement that he wants a solution in Afghanistan and wants to get out is a red herring?
If that were true, then we should have seen the end of the presence of the United States military force in Afghanistan, but he has raised the number a little bit. I mean, he started last year, and he sent a few thousand more troops to Afghanistan. And they are now working in order to, strike at Iran through proxy forces, not through their own forces, of course, as plans and estimates show that they may not do that directly through using their own military power, since the stakes are high because of specific reasons. So they are using proxy forces. We should remember that as Iran is posed, two types of threats from Afghanistan. One is extremism and terrorism. The other one is narcotics. That's a very serious threat to Iran. We should remember that Afghanistan is, the main producer of opium, and the plantation of drugs in the country have grown over 40 times, some 43 times since 2001.
Under the watchful eye of the United States. But Mustafa Khoshchasham, stay with me. I want to pull in Rahimullah Yousafzai. Rahimullah Yousafzai, Mustafa Khoshchasham's thesis is that it's a red herring. The Americans don't want to get out of Afghanistan. As a matter of fact, far from doing that, what they're doing is to transfer ISIL cadres and their resources from Syria, where Khoshchasham says they've already been defeated, to Afghanistan. And this is basically a check on Iran, Russia, and also China. Would you agree with this thesis? Is there evidence that the U.S. is doing this?
Not only the Iranians, but also other countries have this concern. And, Russia, for example, even I think Pakistan, they have this concern that there is some game going on in Afghanistan, and they suspect the U.S. to be supporting Daesh or ISIS. That's also being mentioned by some Afghan politicians, including Hamid Karzai. The Americans have not been able to clear their position. They are still being suspected of all this. But the fact remains that the IS IS also is attacking the Afghan government. The Afghan government actually has been brought into power by the Americans.
Yes.
Again, we don't know because the ISIS has suffered heavily, but they still are there. They have not been fully defeated. So there is some power, some people who are supporting it. And it's still they're fighting, not only in eastern Afghanistan, but also in certain other provinces in Afghanistan. So there will be suspicion about the American intention, especially because, as everybody mentioned earlier, we don't know the American ambition, American agenda, the end game in the mind of the Americans. So unless the Americans make their position clear, unless they put their cards on the table, there will be this, suspicion about American intentions.
Okay. Mustafa Kushashim, Rahimullah Yousafzai has said that the other countries also that are concerned about this. And also some Afghan politicians have talked about it, including the former president Hamid Karzai. But there is no real evidence that, there's accusation, there are allegations. When I was in Afghanistan, I also heard them. But when I asked people what the evidence is, no one really had any evidence. When Iran says this, does Iran have concrete evidence of the US actually following this policy, or is this one of those things that become part of the narrative within an adversarial, conflictual paradigm?
No, there have been many statements by senior Iranian officials, including top military aide to the Iranian Supreme Leader, Major General Yahya Rahim Safavi, as well as many other IRGC and army officials who have all been speaking on the basis of intel provided by Iranian intelligence bodies. In the meantime, ISIL's, the United States cooperation with ISIL is nothing surprising, as there have been official reports given out by the media outlets all throughout the last at least 3 or 4 years in Iraq, in Syria, and in Iran, in Arabic, in English. I would be happy to provide you with many links in this regard, that the United States has been rescuing ISIL commanders that have come under siege in Deir ez-Zor in southeastern Syria, giving them heliborne operation in order to rescue them, and they have been taking them out of, the hell with much military support and heliporn operations.
So why would they drop what they call the mother of all bombs near Jalalabad, which was essentially, as far as the American military statement was concerned, this was to destroy an ISIS camp near Jalalabad?
We don't know if this has been really an operation or to stage some show in order to show the world that we have the power and we are still the top military force in the world. What I know for sure is that for a country that has been claiming to be the superpower for the last 1 century, it should be very much easy to, defeat some, barefooted fighters that are not equipped with heavy or at least Air Force and could be traced easily. What I see is that the United States has been present for 17 years in Afghanistan, but ISIL is now growing in the same country.
Okay. Last question before I wrap up the program, Mustafa Kushashim. What are the Iranian objectives as far as Afghanistan is concerned? What would be Iran's end game? Of course, the withdrawal of the US troops, but what else?
Well, Iran wants stability and security for sure in all countries of the region, especially the ones that neighbor the Islamic Republic, including Afghanistan, because, tensions, extremism, and terrorism, and especially drug, they spill over. They cannot be confined to any borders, geographical borders. Maybe the United States has learned this lesson, probably some officials, at least former U.S. officials, when they came to realize that using extremism, proxy forces, and terrorism, making an instrumental use of them, cannot be confined to borders, and they would strike back. We have seen so many, terrorist attacks in Europe and in also America that have been done by the same group.
I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you, which is why, because many of these attacks in Europe were essentially planned or executed or perpetrated by ISIS. So it sort of makes no sense for the US to bring them over to Afghanistan. But thank you so much for giving your insights and the Iranian perspective on this, on Trump's regional policy. I will just go back to Rahimullah Yousafzai for a last comment. Rahimullah Yousafzai, are you optimistic about, Dawood Azmi was talking about 3 phases. We are still in phase 1, and already there's a lot of, pessimism in terms of whether this will actually fly. Do you think that we will be able to get to phase 2?
Dawood Azmi talked about 3 phases. Ashraf Ghani is also talking about 3 phases. Dr. Abdullah, the chief executive officer, is talking about 5 phases. Okay. So, everybody has got his own idea how to bring peace. But, I will tell you about a comment made by the Taliban. They said that Ashraf Ghani is taking big decisions, talking big, without having any real power.
Okay.
Now, the fact remains that as long as the foreign forces are in Afghanistan and there is a commitment by the US that they will stand by the Afghan government, then the Afghan government, will survive. And, it can talk with Taliban or anybody else. But it's dependent on the foreign support. And that is a big question mark. And Taliban know about it. Taliban will take their policy. They will take their next step according to this.
According to this, absolutely.
The Afghan government cannot survive.
Absolutely.
And Ashraf Ghani himself has said that without international assistance, his army will collapse.
His army will collapse.
Months.
It's more or less the same. Yeah, it's more or less the same assessment given by the new commander of the U.S. Central Command. Thank you so much, Rahimullah Yousafzai, for giving us your perspective. We were talking about President Trump's regional policy towards Afghanistan and whether talks with the Taliban will fly, whether Taliban will stop resisting the demand that they also talk to the government in Kabul. As we can see, there's a catch-22 here. Are we talking about the U.S. withdrawal first? Are we talking about first setting up some kind of parameters of talks which also involve the Kabul government before a timetable for withdrawal can be worked out? Of course, this is an unfolding situation, and we looked at it last week also, and probably in the weeks later also, we will come back to this. That's all for today. Tomorrow, we shall bring you the perspective on the Greater Middle East. Until then, it's goodbye from me. Stay tuned.